There is a city buried beneath the cornfields of Illinois, not metaphorically buried, not lost to memory alone, but actually beneath the earth. Its pyramids still rise above the floodplain of the Mississippi River, grass-covered mounds that most drivers pass without a second glance. 1,000 years ago, this city held more people than London. Its central plaza could have contained 40 football fields. Its builders moved 22 million cubic feet of earth, basket by basket, on human backs, to create monuments that have lasted longer than any building made of steel. The city's name, the one we use today, is Cahokia, but that is not what its builders called it. We do not know their word for this place. We do not know what language they spoke when they stood atop the Great Pyramid and watched the sun rise over their creation. We know only what they left behind. The earth itself, shaped and measured and aligned with such precision that it still speaks across the gap of centuries, still tells us something about who they were and what they understood about the world. This is the first thing you need to know about ancient America. It was not empty, it was not waiting, it was not primitive. And the story you were told about this continent, the one that begins with Columbus and moves forward through a narrative of discovery and settlement, that story is not false exactly. It is simply incomplete, profoundly, startlingly incomplete. If you are finding value in this exploration, if this journey into America's deep past resonates with you, please consider subscribing to this channel. A like helps others discover these stories, and sharing this video supports the work of bringing forgotten history into the light. Thank you. Now let us begin at the beginning, or at least as close to the beginning as the evidence allows us to approach. The question of when human beings first arrived in the Americas is one of the most actively debated topics in modern archaeology. For most of the 20th century, the answer seemed settled. People crossed from Siberia to Alaska across a land bridge called Beringia during the last ice age, roughly 13,000 years ago. They walked across tundra that is now beneath 100 meters of ocean, following game animals into a new world. This was called the Clovis First model, named after distinctive stone tools found in New Mexico in the 1930s. The model was clean, simple, reassuring in its clarity. And then the evidence started to complicate things. In southern Chile, at a site called Monte Verde, archaeologists found clear evidence of human habitation dating to 14,500 years ago. This created an immediate problem. If people only crossed into North America 13,000 years ago, how did they reach the southern tip of South America just 1,500 years later? The distance is immense. The terrain is challenging. The time frame does not allow for the slow, gradual expansion that population movement requires. Monte Verde was not an anomaly. In central Mexico, researchers working at Chiquihuite Cave announced findings in 2019 that pushed human presence back to 30,000 years ago. 30,000 years. That is not a minor revision of the timeline. That is a complete reconsideration of when and how people reached this continent. The scientific community is still processing these findings, still debating the details, still excavating new sites that might confirm or challenge these early dates. But the direction of the evidence is clear. People have been in the Americas far longer than the Clovis first model suggested. The question is no longer whether the model needs revision, but how extensive that revision must be. And there is something else, something that makes the story even more complex. The people who left the earliest traces in the Americas were not all genetically identical. Ancient DNA analysis reveals multiple waves of migration, multiple founding populations carrying different genetic signatures, arriving by different routes, possibly separated by thousands of years. Some may have walked across Beringia when the land bridge was accessible during periods of low sea level. Others may have traveled along the Pacific coast by boat, following a kelp highway of marine resources that stretched from Japan to South America. The evidence for this coastal route is frustratingly incomplete, because when the Ice Age ended and sea levels rose, most of those ancient coastal sites were submerged beneath hundreds of feet of water. But the genetic signatures remain. They are written in the DNA of ancient individuals whose remains have been carefully excavated and analyzed. They tell a story of diversity, of multiple origins, of a peopling of the Americas that was far more complex than any single migration event could explain. This matters because it shapes everything that came after. The Americas were not settled by a single founding population that then spread in isolation across two continents. They were reached, repeatedly, by different groups who brought different knowledge, different technologies, different ways of organizing society. Over tens of thousands of years, these populations moved, mixed, adapted to every environment from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforest, and built cultures of remarkable diversity and sophistication. Let us return to Cahokia, to the grass-covered mounds in southern Illinois. The city reached its peak around the year 1050 in the Common Era. At that moment, it was one of the largest cities in the world, larger than London, larger than Paris. Home to somewhere between 10 and 20,000 people living in a densely packed urban core, with thousands more in surrounding communities connected to the central city by politics, trade, and shared ceremonial practice. The centerpiece of Cahokia is Monk's Mound, named not for its builders, but for French monks who briefly lived nearby in the 18th century. The pyramid covers 14 acres at its base and rises 100 feet above the floodplain. It is the largest pre-Columbian earthwork north of Mexico. To build it, workers moved an estimated 22 million cubic feet of earth. They had no metal tools. They had no wheels. They had no draft animals. They carried the earth in baskets on their backs, load by load, layer by layer, over generations. Why would anyone undertake such a project? What purpose justified this extraordinary investment of labor? The answer lies partly in what archaeologists found at the base of the mound. Monk's Mound was not simply a monument. It was a platform, a base for a massive building that once stood at its summit. A building large enough to be seen from miles away, a structure that dominated the visual landscape of the entire region. The person or people who occupied that building held power of a kind that required spectacular display. But Cahokia was more than a pyramid. The city was planned, deliberately and carefully, according to principles that become clear when you map the site from above. The Grand Plaza, a massive open space at the foot of Monk's Mound, was not naturally flat. The builders leveled it by removing the existing topography and replacing it with engineered fill. The precision of this work, documented through archaeological excavation, tells us that someone was in charge, someone with the authority to command the labor of thousands, someone with a vision of what this city should look like. And there is more. West of Monk's Mound, archaeologists discovered a series of post circles, enormous rings of cedar posts set into the ground with astronomical precision. These structures, which researchers have called Woodhenge after the more famous stone circles of Neolithic Europe, were used to track the movements of the sun. On the morning of the spring equinox, an observer standing at the center of the largest circle would have seen the sun rise directly over the peak of Monk's Mound. This is not accident. This is intention. This is a city designed to align with the cosmos, to express through its very layout a particular understanding of the relationship between human life and celestial order. Cahokia also left behind evidence of something darker, something that challenges our assumptions about ancient North American societies. In a burial mound designated by archaeologists as Mound 72, excavators found the remains of a high-status individual laid out on a bed of 20,000 shell beads arranged in the shape of a falcon. Around him were the remains of more than 200 other people, most of them young women between the ages of 15 and 25, apparently sacrificed as part of the burial ceremony. Human sacrifice on this scale suggests a society with rigid hierarchies, with rulers who commanded absolute authority, with systems of power that could demand the deaths of hundreds to honor a single individual. This is not the egalitarian, village-based society that we often imagine when we think of pre-Columbian North America. This is something else entirely. This is a civilization in the fullest sense of that complicated word. And then, around 1300 in the Common Era, Cahokia was abandoned. The city emptied. The population dispersed. Within a few generations, the site was so overgrown that European explorers walking past the mounds thought they were natural hills. What caused the collapse? The leading theory points to environmental stress. Tree ring records from this period show evidence of sustained drought followed by catastrophic flooding. The agricultural systems that fed Cahokia's population would have been severely strained. There is also evidence of defensive walls built around parts of the city in its final decades, suggesting conflict, either internal or external, that may have contributed to the decision to abandon the site. But the people did not vanish. They dispersed to other communities throughout the Mississippi River Valley and beyond. The cultural patterns that Cahokia represented, the mound-building tradition, the ceremonial practices, the systems of belief, these continued in modified forms across the American Southeast and Midwest for centuries after the city fell. The legacy of Cahokia is still present in the landscape, still visible to anyone who knows how to look. The mounds remain, the alignments hold, and the questions persist, patient and unanswered, waiting for the next generation of researchers to bring new tools and new perspectives to this extraordinary site. Before Cahokia, before the great mound cities of the Mississippi Valley, there was Poverty Point. The name is misleading, a product of the 19th century plantation on whose land the site was rediscovered. There was nothing impoverished about the people who built this place. Poverty Point, located in northeastern Louisiana, is one of the oldest and most complex ceremonial centers in North America. It was built roughly 3,500 years ago, more than a millennium before the rise of the cultures we typically associate with complex societies in this region. The site consists of a series of enormous earthen ridges arranged in concentric arcs around a central plaza, plus several large mounds, including a bird-shaped effigy mound that is one of the largest earthen structures in prehistoric North America. The ridge system alone required moving more than 2 million cubic feet of earth. This is a construction project requiring thousands of workers coordinated over many generations. But here is what makes Poverty Point truly remarkable. The people who built it were not farmers. They were hunter-gatherers, more precisely fisher-hunter-gatherers, living on the extraordinary abundance of the Mississippi River Delta. They had no domesticated crops, no agriculture in the sense we typically understand it, and yet they built monuments comparable in scale to anything produced by agricultural civilizations elsewhere in the world. This challenges one of the fundamental assumptions of traditional models of cultural development. The assumption was that you needed agriculture to support the large, permanent populations necessary for monumental construction. Agriculture allowed people to stay in one place, to accumulate surplus food, to free some members of society from subsistence work, so they could specialize in construction or craft production or religious roles. Poverty Point demonstrates that this model is too simple. Under the right environmental conditions, with access to sufficiently abundant and reliable resources, hunter-gatherer societies can support permanent settlements, can accumulate surplus, can organize the labor necessary for monumental architecture. The Mississippi Delta 3,500 years ago was such an environment. The rivers teemed with fish. The wetlands provided abundant plant foods, waterfowl, and game. The people who lived there did not need to farm. The land gave them everything they required, and they were connected, remarkably connected, to communities across vast distances. Poverty Point was the hub of a trade network that stretched from the Rocky Mountains to the Appalachian Mountains, from the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast. Archaeologists have found at the site raw materials that originated hundreds or even thousands of miles away. Copper from the Great Lakes, galena from Missouri and Wisconsin, soapstone from the Appalachians, obsidian from distant volcanic sources. This trade network did not emerge overnight. It was the product of sustained contact, of relationships maintained across generations, of knowledge about distant places, and the routes to reach them passed down through teaching and practice. The people of Poverty Point were not isolated. They were part of a continental system of exchange that linked diverse communities in ways we are only beginning to understand. The site was occupied for several centuries and then, like Cahokia after it, was gradually abandoned. The reasons remain unclear. Environmental change is always a possibility in the dynamic landscape of the Mississippi Delta. Social or political shifts could have redirected the networks of trade and alliance that had sustained the site's importance. Or perhaps the ceremonial functions that made Poverty Point a gathering place for dispersed communities simply migrated to other locations. Whatever the cause, Poverty Point stands as a testament to the ingenuity and organizational capacity of ancient Americans at a time depth that many people still find surprising. 3,500 years ago, when the pyramids of Egypt were already ancient, when the Minoan civilization was flourishing in Crete, when the Shang dynasty was rising in China, the people of the Mississippi Delta were building their own monuments, expressing their own vision of what a ceremonial center should be. Between Poverty Point and Cahokia, between the ancient fisher hunter-gatherers of the Delta and the urban agriculturalists of the Mississippi floodplain, there flourished a culture that archaeologists call the Hopewell tradition. The Hopewell people, who lived roughly from 100 years before the Common Era to 500 years into it, left behind some of the most elaborate earthworks in North America. In southern Ohio, the Newark earthworks at their peak covered more than 4 square miles. They consisted of a great circle, an octagon, a square, and a series of parallel walls and pathways, all connected in a geometric design of remarkable precision. The octagon is particularly significant. Modern surveys have determined that it is aligned to the northernmost moonrise on the horizon, an event that occurs only at the peak of the lunar standstill cycle. This cycle takes 18.6 years to complete. To identify, it requires systematic observation across multiple decades. To encode it in a monumental earthwork requires not just observation but institutional memory, the capacity to plan and execute construction projects that express knowledge accumulated over generations. The Newark octagon is not the only astronomical alignment in the Hopewell earthworks. Multiple sites across Ohio and beyond show orientations to solar events, to lunar events, to the rising points of specific stars. This is not accident. This is systematic astronomical knowledge embedded in the landscape. But the Hopewell tradition was not confined to Ohio. Hopewell-style earthworks and artifacts have been found from Kansas to New York, from the Gulf Coast to the Great Lakes. This geographic spread represents one of the most extensive cultural horizons in pre-Columbian North America. And like Poverty Point before it, the Hopewell world was connected by trade networks of continental scale. The evidence is in the burial mounds. Hopewell burial sites contain obsidian from Yellowstone, copper from Lake Superior, shells from the Gulf of Mexico, mica from the Appalachians, shark teeth from the Atlantic coast. These are not materials that occur naturally in Ohio. They were brought there, traded across hundreds or thousands of miles, incorporated into burial goods and ceremonial objects that were then placed in the mounds with the dead. This trade network implies something profound about the organization of pre-Columbian North America during the Hopewell period. It implies regular communication across enormous distances. It implies shared systems of value that made certain materials desirable to communities separated by weeks or months of travel. It implies a degree of peace, or at least of regulated interaction, that allowed traders to move safely across territories controlled by different groups. The Hopewell tradition, like the cultures that preceded and followed it, eventually declined. Around 500 in the Common Era, the elaborate burial practices ceased, the long-distance trade networks contracted, the construction of new earthworks stopped. The reasons, as always, are debated. Climate change, social reorganization, shifts in religious practice, all have been proposed, but the earthworks remain. In Newark, Ohio, much of the ancient complex has been built over by the modern city, but portions survive. The Great Circle is preserved as a state park. The Octagon, ironically, is part of a golf course, a fact that has generated decades of controversy among archaeologists and indigenous communities who see this as a profound disrespect to one of the most significant ancient sites in North America. There are ongoing efforts to have the Newark earthworks designated as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, to afford it the protection and recognition that its significance demands. These efforts are part of a larger process of reckoning with the depth and complexity of America's pre-Columbian past, a reckoning that is still incomplete. The sleep comes easier when you have somewhere to rest your attention, some large and patient thing to contemplate. The mounds are good for this. They have been standing for centuries, weathering storms and seasons, holding their alignments even as the societies that built them transformed and dispersed. Tonight, as you settle into rest, you might hold in your mind the image of Monk's Mound in the golden light of a summer evening. 100 feet of earth rising from the Illinois bottomlands, grass-covered and ancient, aligned with the equinox sun. Or the concentric arcs of Poverty Point, curving through the Louisiana landscape like the ripples from a stone dropped in still water 3,000 years ago. These places are real, they are still there, and they are still, in their patient way, telling their stories to anyone willing to listen. In the next part of this journey, we will travel to the deserts of the American Southwest, to canyon cities and astronomical observatories built by people who understood the sky with a precision that still astonishes modern astronomers. We will explore the question of water in the driest places on the continent and what it meant for ancient engineers to bring rivers across the desert. For now, rest. The ancient continent is quiet around you, full of stories still being uncovered, still being understood. The mounds are patient. They will wait. There is a canyon in northwestern New Mexico where the silence has weight. The walls rise pale and striated in the afternoon sun, sandstone layers laid down millions of years ago, now carved and shaped by wind and rare rain. The sky above is so intensely blue that it almost hurts to look at directly. This is Chaco Canyon, and 1,000 years ago it was the center of a world. The people who built Chaco are known to archaeologists as the ancestral Pueblones. Some older texts call them the Anasazi, a Navajo word whose exact translation is disputed. They were not mysterious, they were not vanished. They were human beings who, over several centuries, developed one of the most sophisticated cultures in pre-Columbian North America in one of the most challenging environments on the continent. Chaco Canyon sits in the high desert of the Colorado Plateau, a landscape where water is scarce. Where summer temperatures can exceed 100 degrees and winter temperatures can plunge below zero, where the margin between abundance and starvation is measured in inches of rainfall that may or may not arrive in any given year. In this unforgiving place, the ancestral Pueblones built great houses, massive multi-storied structures made from precisely shaped sandstone blocks and wooden beams hauled from forests dozens of miles away. Pueblo Bonito, the largest of these great houses, contained more than 600 rooms and rose to 5 stories in some sections. It was not surpassed as the largest building in North America until the late 19th century, when modern construction techniques finally exceeded what the Chacoans had achieved with stone tools and human labor 1,000 years earlier. The precision of Chacoan construction is immediately apparent to anyone who examines the walls that still stand. The sandstone blocks are shaped to fit together with minimal gaps. The walls are straight, plumb, carefully coursed. This is not rough stonework. This is careful masonry, the product of skilled craftspeople who understood their materials and took pride in their work. But it is the precision of the planning, not just the building, that reveals the true sophistication of Chacoan culture. Chaco Canyon sits at the center of a road network that extends for hundreds of miles in multiple directions. These roads were discovered when aerial photography of the region began to reveal long, straight lines crossing the desert, lines too regular to be natural features, too persistent to be accident. The Chacoan roads are wide, often 30 feet across, and they run in remarkably straight lines regardless of terrain. They do not curve around obstacles the way a footpath would. They cut through obstacles or climb over them via staircases carved directly into canyon walls. Where do the roads lead? Some connect to outlier communities, to other great houses built on the Chacoan model, but located far from the canyon itself. The spacing of these outliers is consistent enough to suggest that the entire network was planned as a unified system. Some researchers have described the Chacoan road system as a kind of sacred geography, a physical inscription of cosmological principles onto the landscape. Others see it as political and economic infrastructure, a system for moving goods, people, and power across a large territory. Both interpretations may be partially correct. The roads served practical purposes, certainly, but they also served symbolic ones. In a culture where the built environment was designed to express and reinforce a particular understanding of how the world is organized, the roads would have been both functional and meaningful. Some of the roads extend beyond any known destination. They go out into the desert and simply stop, or they continue to places where archaeologists have found no evidence of any permanent settlement. These sections of road, without obvious endpoints, have puzzled researchers for decades. Were they ritual pathways, routes for ceremonial processions? Do they lead to sites not yet discovered? Or do they serve some purpose we have not yet imagined? The questions remain open. The roads remain visible, faint lines across the desert, still pointing in their original directions after 1,000 years. The astronomical knowledge embedded in Chaco Canyon is extraordinary. The great houses are aligned to the cardinal directions with precision that required careful observation and measurement. The southeast corner of Pueblo Bonito aligns with the winter solstice sunrise. The main axis of several great houses tracks the summer solstice. These are not approximate alignments. These are precise orientations that required intention and skill to achieve. On Fajada Butte, a prominent mesa within the canyon, archaeologists documented a spiral petroglyph that functions as a solar calendar. 3 stone slabs positioned in front of the spiral create daggers of light that pass through the carved design in specific ways at specific times of the year. At the summer solstice, a blade of light bisects the spiral perfectly. At the winter solstice, 2 blades of light frame the spiral on either side. At the equinoxes, a smaller dagger passes through the center of a smaller spiral carved nearby. This is not random. This is not approximate. This is a precisely calibrated instrument for marking solar events, created by people who understood the relationship between the sun's position and the passage of time with remarkable accuracy. The astronomical knowledge at Chaco was not merely observational, it was predictive. The builders knew when the solstices would occur before they occurred. They knew the pattern well enough to encode it in permanent stone, to create markers that would continue to function generation after generation, teaching each new cohort of sky watchers the patterns their ancestors had discovered. Why did this matter so much to them? Why invest such effort in tracking celestial events? The answer lies in the agricultural calendar. In an environment where rainfall is unpredictable and growing seasons are short, knowing exactly when to plant, when to expect the rains, when to prepare for winter, these were not academic questions. They were matters of survival. The ceremonial calendar and the agricultural calendar were inseparable. The movements of the sun marked not just ritual occasions, but practical turning points in the annual cycle of planting and harvest. But there was more to it than practical necessity. The Chacons, like many ancient cultures around the world, understood themselves to be part of a cosmos, participants in a vast ordered system that included the earth and the sky and everything between. The alignments of their buildings expressed this understanding. They built in such a way that their architecture harmonized with celestial movements, so that standing in certain places at certain times, you could witness the convergence of human creation and cosmic order. This is a profoundly different way of thinking about architecture than what most modern cultures practice. We build for function, for aesthetics, for efficiency. The Chacons built for all of those things, but they also built to participate in something larger than human purposes alone. Around 1150 in the Common Era, Chaco Canyon was largely abandoned. The great houses emptied. The ceremonial gatherings ceased. The roads fell silent. The abandonment was not sudden, not a single catastrophic event, but a gradual process that took several decades. Tree ring records from this period show severe drought across the Colorado Plateau, a sustained period of aridity that would have put enormous stress on the agricultural systems that fed Chaco's population. But drought alone does not fully explain the abandonment. The ancestral Pueblones had survived droughts before. They had developed techniques for water management, for storing food, for maintaining communities through difficult periods. Something more than simple environmental stress must have contributed to the decision to leave. There is evidence at some Chacon sites of violence, of burned structures, of hasty departures. There is evidence that the social and political systems that had organized labor and trade were under strain in the final decades of the canyon's occupation. The hierarchy that had made it possible to build the great houses, to maintain the road network, to coordinate ceremonial gatherings of thousands of people, that hierarchy was breaking down. The collapse of Chaco, like the collapse of Cahokia, was probably a convergence of factors, environmental and social, building on each other until the system could no longer be sustained. When the center could not hold, when Chaco could no longer fulfill its role as the ceremonial and political heart of the region, people made the rational decision to disperse to communities where resources were more reliable and social tensions less acute. But they did not vanish. The descendants of the Chaco people are widely believed to be the modern Pueblo communities of the American Southwest, the Hopi, the Zuni, the people of Acoma and Laguna, and the Rio Grande Pueblos. These communities carry forward, in their languages and their ceremonies and their architectural traditions, the inheritance of what Chaco was. The connection is not always direct or simple. 1,000 years of history intervened between the abandonment of Chaco and the present day, 1,000 years of movement and adaptation and change. But the threads of continuity are real. The Pueblo worldview, the understanding of the relationship between human communities and the land they inhabit, the ceremonial practices that mark the turning of the seasons, these have roots that stretch back to Chaco and beyond. When Hopi elders speak of Chaco as a place their ancestors knew, they are not invoking vague mythology. They are drawing on oral traditions that preserve genuine historical memory, traditions that have been tested and confirmed by archaeological evidence in case after case. The respectful approach to sites like Chaco requires listening to these traditions, incorporating them into our understanding alongside the archaeological evidence, recognizing that the people who live in continuity with this past have knowledge that cannot be recovered from the ground alone. South of Chaco, in the Sonoran Desert of what is now Arizona, another ancient culture was transforming its landscape through mastery of water. The Hohokam people flourished in the desert basins around the Salt and Gila rivers from roughly the 1st century of the Common Era to the mid-15th century. The name Hohokam is not what they called themselves. It is an Wadam word meaning, roughly, those who have gone. The Wadam people of southern Arizona are widely believed to be the descendants of the Hohokam, inheritors of a tradition that achieved something remarkable in one of the harshest environments in North America. The Hohokam built canal systems. Not small ditches for garden plots, but major hydraulic engineering projects on a scale that impressed the American Army engineers who surveyed them in the 19th century. At the peak of Hohokam Canal construction, more than 800 miles of canals crisscrossed the desert valleys, bringing water from the Salt and Gila rivers to fields that would otherwise have been unable to support agriculture. Some of these canals were enormous, 20 feet deep and 80 feet wide, excavated entirely by hand with stone and bone and wooden tools. The engineering required to maintain a gradient that kept water flowing over distances of 10, 20, 30 miles without modern surveying equipment, demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of hydrology and landscape. The canals allowed the Hohokam to support a substantial population in a region that receives less than 10 inches of rain per year. Estimates suggest that at its peak, the Hohokam irrigation system may have fed as many as 50,000 people living in the desert basins, a population density that would not be matched again in the region until the 20th century. When the city of Phoenix was founded and began to expand in the late 19th century, the developers made a discovery. The most efficient routes for irrigation canals in the Salt River Valley were the routes the Hohokam had already identified and built 1,000 years earlier. Modern Phoenix reused many of the ancient canal alignments, built its agricultural and urban infrastructure on top of a pre-Columbian foundation. This is literally true. Phoenix sits on Hohokam engineering. The city is possible, in part, because the Hohokam had already solved the problem of bringing water across the desert. But the Hohokam, like the Chacons, like the Cahokians, eventually collapsed. Around 1450 in the Common Era, the major Hohokam population centers were abandoned. The canal systems fell into disuse. The population dispersed. The causes are debated. Climate records show periods of both drought and catastrophic flooding during the Hohokam decline. Either condition would have stressed the canal systems. Drought would have reduced the water available to distribute. Flooding would have damaged the canals themselves, requiring constant maintenance and repair. There is also evidence of soil salinization, a common problem in irrigation agriculture. When water evaporates from irrigated fields in arid regions, it leaves behind dissolved salts. Over time, these salts accumulate in the soil, reducing fertility and eventually making the land unsuitable for crops. The Hohokam may have been victims of their own success, their intensive agriculture gradually degrading the resource base that sustained it. The Wadam traditions carry memories of what happened. Stories speak of the abandonment of the great houses, of the dispersal of the people, of a transformation in how communities organized themselves and related to the land. The transition from Hohokam to Wadam was not a disappearance, but a change, a cultural adaptation to new circumstances. In the canyons and mesas of the Four Corners region, where Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico meet, the ancestral Pueblones built cliff dwellings of breathtaking beauty and remarkable preservation. Mesa Verde, in southwestern Colorado, is the most famous of these sites. The cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde were built into natural alcoves in the canyon walls, protected from weather by the overhanging rock. The largest of these, Cliff Palace, contains more than 150 rooms and 23 kivas, the circular ceremonial chambers that are characteristic of Pueblo architecture. The cliff dwellings were built late in the ancestral Puebloan sequence, mostly in the 1200s, just before the final abandonment of the Four Corners region. They represent a concentration of population into defensible locations, a change from the more dispersed settlement patterns of earlier periods. Why move into the cliffs? Defense is the obvious answer. The dwellings are difficult to access, built in alcoves that can only be reached by climbing or by ladders that can be pulled up. If the communities were facing external threats, or if social tensions between groups had escalated to violence, moving into defensible positions would have been a rational response. But there may have been other factors. The alcoves provide shelter from sun and weather. They are cooler in summer, warmer in winter than exposed locations. They have springs that provide reliable water. The move into the cliffs may have been as much about resource concentration as about defense. The cliff dwellings were occupied for less than a century. By the end of the 1300s, Mesa Verde and the other cliff-dwelling sites of the Four Corners region were abandoned. The people moved south and east to the Rio Grande Valley and to the Hopi Mesas, where their descendants still live. The abandonment of the Four Corners is one of the great migrations in North American prehistory. Tree ring records show a devastating drought in the late 1300s, the worst in 1,000 years. But as with other abandonments we have discussed, drought alone does not explain everything. There is evidence of violence in some of the late cliff-dwelling sites, evidence of malnutrition and stress in the human remains. The social fabric was tearing, the environment was failing. And people made the difficult decision to leave the homes their ancestors had occupied for centuries, to move to new lands where they would have to negotiate with existing communities, to begin again in circumstances that must have seemed desperately uncertain. The ruins they left behind are among the most visited archaeological sites in North America. Thousands of people walk through Cliff Palace every year, stand in the ancient plaza, look up at the blackened ceiling of the kivas where fires burned 700 years ago. But the sites are not merely ruins, not merely tourist destinations. They are places of significance to the Pueblo communities whose ancestors built them. Many Pueblo people still visit these sites for ceremonial purposes, still maintain relationships with the places their forebears called home. The abandonment was not forgetting. The connection persists. The question of abandonment, of collapse, of why complex societies fall apart runs through the entire story of ancient America. Cahokia collapsed, Chaco collapsed, the Hohokam dispersed, the cliff dwellings emptied. Again and again, cultures that achieved remarkable things, that built on scales that required sustained organization and coordination, came apart. This pattern has sometimes been used to argue that these cultures were not truly sophisticated, that they lacked the resilience or the organizational capacity to sustain themselves over the long term. But this argument misunderstands both the nature of collapse and the nature of sustainability. Collapse in most cases was not failure, it was adaptation. When environmental conditions changed, when drought persisted, when violence escalated, when the social systems that had organized life in a particular way became unsustainable, people made rational choices to reorganize, to move, to transform their institutions and their relationships. The ancestors of the modern Pueblo peoples did not disappear when they left Chaco and Mesa Verde. They moved to new places, built new communities, adapted their practices to new circumstances. The cultural continuity from the ancient cliff dwellers to the modern Pueblos is demonstrable in language, in ceremony, in architectural forms, in systems of belief. What was lost in these transitions was not the people or the culture in some essential sense, but specific forms of organization, specific places, specific ways of doing things. And yes, that loss was often traumatic. The oral traditions of many Pueblo communities speak of the migrations as difficult times, times of hunger and conflict and uncertainty. But survival is its own achievement. Adaptation is its own form of success. The capacity to transform rather than to persist rigidly in forms that no longer work, that is a kind of resilience that deserves recognition. The ancient Southwest was not a place of perpetual stability. It was a place of change, of movement, of cultures rising and transforming and continuing in new forms. The archaeological record shows us the monuments and the abandonments. The living communities show us the continuity. As the night deepens and sleep draws closer, let your mind rest on the image of a canyon in moonlight. Sandstone walls glowing pale silver, shadows pooling in the empty rooms of the great houses, the silence so complete that you can almost hear the stars turning overhead. Chaco Canyon is still there, protected now as a national historical park, visited by researchers and tourists and Pueblo people maintaining connections to ancestral places. The great houses still stand, their walls still aligned with the solstice sun, their astronomical knowledge still encoded in stone. In the American Southwest, the ancient past is not deeply buried. It is visible, present, part of the landscape in ways that make the continuity of time feel immediate. You can stand in a plaza where people gathered 1,000 years ago. You can look through a doorway aligned to catch the winter sunrise. You can see, if you visit at the right time, the dagger of light pass through the spiral petroglyph on Fajada Butte, just as it has done every summer solstice for 10 centuries. The sleep that comes in the presence of such continuity is different, deeper somehow, connected to something older than your own small moment. Rest now in the knowledge that the ancient builders understood time, understood how to make things that would last, understood that their work would speak to people they would never meet across distances of centuries. In the next section, we will turn our attention to the great mound building cultures east of the Mississippi, to effigy mounds shaped like animals, to trade networks that span the continent, to the question of what knowledge was encoded in earth and alignment and passed forward through generations. The desert is quiet, the stars are bright, the ancient walls hold their alignments, and somewhere in the silence, the past is still speaking to anyone who knows how to listen. Rest well. There is a ridge in Adams County, Ohio, where the earth takes the shape of a serpent. The ridge overlooks Brush Creek, a small waterway that winds through the hills of southern Ohio. From the ground, the ridge looks unremarkable, just another wooded rise in the Appalachian foothills. But from above, the pattern becomes clear. A quarter-mile-long earthwork in the form of an enormous snake, its body coiling in 7 deep curves, its tail tightly spiraled, its mouth open, appearing to swallow or disgorge an oval earthwork that might represent an egg or the sun. This is Serpent Mound, one of the most distinctive and most studied effigy mounds in North America. Effigy mounds are earthworks shaped to represent animals, birds, humans, or other figures. They are found primarily in the upper Mississippi River Valley, concentrated in what is now Wisconsin, but examples exist from the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast. Serpent Mound is unusual because of its size, its precision, and its location on a ridge rather than on level ground. The serpent is aligned with astronomical events. The head points toward the summer solstice sunset. The coils align with other solar and lunar positions. Whether these alignments were intentional or whether they emerged from the natural topography of the ridge is a question that researchers continue to debate, but the correlation between the serpent's orientation and celestial events is striking enough to suggest deliberate design. Who built Serpent Mound? This question has proven difficult to answer definitively. Early excavations attributed it to the Adena culture, which flourished in the Ohio Valley from roughly 1,000 years before the Common Era to 100 years into it. More recent analysis has suggested connections to the Fort Ancient culture, which lived in the region much later, from roughly 1000 to 1600 in the Common Era. It is possible that the mound was built by one culture and modified or maintained by later peoples. It is possible that the site held significance across multiple cultural periods, that it was recognized as a special place by successive generations who each contributed to its form. What is clear is that someone invested enormous effort to create this image on the landscape, to shape the earth into a form that could only be fully appreciated from a vantage point high above, a perspective the builders themselves could never have occupied. This suggests that the mound was built not for human eyes alone, but for something or someone else, for spirits or deities understood to observe from the sky, or perhaps simply as an expression of a cosmological principle that required manifestation in permanent form. The serpent has held its shape for at least 1,000 years, possibly much longer. It has weathered countless storms, endured the clearing of surrounding forests, survived the plowing and development of the surrounding landscape. In the late 19th century, it nearly disappeared. A farmer who owned the land planned to level the mound for agricultural use. A Boston archaeologist named Frederick Putnam raised funds to purchase the site and preserve it, one of the first acts of archaeological preservation in American history. Serpent Mound is now protected as a state memorial. You can walk along the serpent's body on a paved path, follow its coils from tail to head. You can stand at the overlook and see the entire form spread out below you. And you can contemplate the question that the mound poses simply by existing. What moves people to reshape the earth itself into symbols, into statements, into forms that will endure long after their creators are gone? The effigy mound tradition reached its fullest expression in what is now southern Wisconsin. Hundreds of effigy mounds dot the landscape of this region, most built between roughly 700 and 1200 in the Common Era. They take the forms of bears, birds, deer, panthers, turtles, and humans. Some are small, only a few feet across. Others are enormous, stretching hundreds of feet across the landscape. The Effigy Mounds National Monument in northeastern Iowa preserves nearly 200 mounds, including several large bird effigies with wingspans exceeding 200 feet. These mounds were not primarily burial sites, though some contain human remains. They were markers, territorial boundaries perhaps, or cosmological maps, expressions of a worldview in which the landscape was populated by animal spirits, beings with their own intelligence and their own significance in the order of things. The people who built the effigy mounds are believed to be ancestral to the modern Ho-Chunk, formerly known as the Winnebago, and other Siouan and Algonquian peoples of the western Great Lakes region. The oral traditions of these communities speak of the mounds as ancient, as features of the landscape that connect the present to a deep past. What was the purpose of creating these animal forms? The archaeological evidence suggests that the mounds marked significant places, that they were built at locations where different landscape features converged, where rivers met or where trails crossed, where the boundary between one territory and another needed to be acknowledged. But the mounds were also ceremonial. They were places where offerings were made, where the dead were sometimes interred, where communities gathered for purposes we can only partially reconstruct. The animal forms were not decorative. They were meaningful, each species carrying associations and powers understood within the belief systems of the mound builders. The bird effigies, for example, likely represented upper world spirits, beings associated with the sky and the heavens. The water spirits, panthers and turtles, represented the lower world, the realm beneath the earth and water. The linear mounds and the human effigies might have represented the middle world, the realm of human habitation situated between the celestial and the subterranean. This three-part cosmos, upper world, middle world, and lower world, appears repeatedly in Native American cosmologies across different regions and different language families. The effigy mounds can be understood as physical manifestations of this cosmological structure, as ways of inscribing onto the landscape itself the fundamental categories through which people understood reality. The effigy mound tradition ended around 1200 in the Common Era, replaced by other forms of ceremonial expression, other ways of marking the landscape as significant. But the mounds themselves endured. Many were plowed under as Euro-American agriculture spread across Wisconsin in the 19th century. It is estimated that more than 75% of the original effigy mounds have been destroyed, but hundreds remain, protected now in parks and preserves, still visible expressions of an ancient understanding of the relationship between land and spirit. Move west from the effigy mound region, across the Mississippi River and onto the Great Plains, and you encounter a different tradition of landscape modification. The medicine wheels of the northern plains are stone circles, cairns connected by stone lines radiating from a central hub. They are found from Wyoming to Alberta, from Montana to Saskatchewan, scattered across the high plains and the mountain parks of the Rocky Mountain front. The Bighorn Medicine Wheel in Wyoming is among the largest and best preserved. It sits on Medicine Mountain at an elevation of nearly 10,000 feet, accessible only during the brief summer months when snow melts enough to allow passage. The wheel consists of a central cairn surrounded by a circle of stones roughly 80 feet in diameter, with 28 stone lines radiating outward like spokes. The wheel is aligned with astronomical events. The astronomer John Eddy documented in the 1970s that certain stone cairns around the wheel's perimeter mark the summer solstice, sunrise, and sunset, as well as the rising points of three bright stars that appeared on the eastern horizon just before dawn in the weeks around the summer solstice. These alignments are not approximate. They are precise enough to function as a calendar, marking the turning of the year and the approaching time when communities would gather for summer ceremonies. The sun dance, the most important ceremony of many plains cultures, was traditionally held in midsummer, timed to the period when the alignments marked by the medicine wheel would have been visible. The age of the Bighorn medicine wheel is uncertain. Radiocarbon dating and other methods suggest it is at least several hundred years old, with some evidence pointing to origins more than 1,000 years in the past. But dating stone structures is notoriously difficult. The stones themselves are not organic and cannot be carbon dated directly. What can be dated are organic materials found in association with the stones, charcoal from fires, wooden stakes used in construction, bone or plant material deposited in cairns. What is clear is that the medicine wheels represent a long tradition of astronomical observation on the plains. Similar structures are found across a wide geographic area, suggesting either shared knowledge among different groups or the persistence of a very old tradition that predates the historic divisions among plains peoples. The function of the medicine wheels went beyond simple astronomical observation. They were ceremonial sites, places where vision quests were undertaken, where offerings were left, where the boundary between the ordinary world and the spirit world was understood to be permeable. Many medicine wheels show evidence of repeated use over long periods, of fires built and offerings deposited, and cairns modified or added by successive generations. The traditions associated with medicine wheels are still maintained by several plains nations. The sites are visited for ceremonial purposes, treated as sacred places where the knowledge and the spiritual power of the ancestors remain accessible. The relationship between modern plains communities and these ancient stone circles is not one of distant curiosity, but of active engagement, of continuity across time that the stones themselves help to maintain. The Great Plains before European contact were home to millions of bison and to human cultures that had developed, over thousands of years, the most sophisticated system of large mammal management the world has ever seen. The bison herds shaped everything about plains life. They provided food, certainly, but also hides for clothing and shelter, bones for tools and weapons, sinew for cordage, horns for containers and ceremonial objects, even dung for fuel in a largely treeless landscape. The relationship between plains peoples and the bison was total, comprehensive, expressed in both practical adaptation and spiritual recognition. The buffalo jump is perhaps the most dramatic expression of this relationship. A buffalo jump is a cliff face, sometimes reinforced with stone cairns and drive lanes, used to stampede bison herds to their deaths in organized mass kills. The oldest confirmed buffalo jumps in North America date back more than 10,000 years. They were used continuously across this entire span, modified and improved, maintained as part of the cultural inheritance passed from generation to generation. The head-smashed-in buffalo jump in Alberta is one of the best preserved and most extensively studied. The site was used for nearly 6,000 years, from roughly 3,500 years before the Common Era until the 1800s. The bone deposits at the base of the cliff are more than 30 feet deep in places, representing thousands of individual kills across thousands of years. Running a buffalo jump required detailed knowledge of bison behavior, of the landscape, of wind and weather. It required organization, the coordination of hunters playing specific roles, some driving the herd from miles away, others positioned to funnel the animals toward the cliff, others waiting at the base to process the kill. It required timing, the ability to choose the right moment when weather and herd position and all other factors aligned. This knowledge was accumulated through observation across many lifetimes, refined through practice, transmitted through teaching and apprenticeship. It was encoded in stories, in songs, in ceremonies that preserved the essential information while also embedding it in cultural meaning. The introduction of the horse in the 1600s reintroduced actually, since horses had been native to North America until their extinction at the end of the last ice age, transformed plains culture with extraordinary speed. Within a few generations, cultures like the Comanche, the Lakota, the Cheyenne had adapted so completely to horse-based hunting and warfare that the horse seemed to European observers like an eternal feature of plains life, rather than a recent innovation. But the horse was a tool, a transformative tool certainly, but a tool applied to knowledge that was already ancient. The understanding of bison ecology, the organization of the hunt, the spiritual frameworks that govern the relationship between people and prey, all of this predated the horse by thousands of years. The horse made certain practices more efficient, allowed greater mobility, changed the scale at which communities could operate. But the foundation was old, tested across countless generations. The Pacific Northwest coast of North America supported cultures of remarkable complexity without agriculture. The combination of cold, nutrient-rich ocean water, massive seasonal salmon runs, abundant marine mammals, and dense coastal forests created an environment where human communities could achieve levels of social organization and cultural production usually associated with agricultural societies. The peoples of the Northwest Coast, the Haida, the Tlingit, the Kwakwaka'wakwa, the Nucharnolth, and many others, developed social structures with elaborate hierarchies, hereditary chiefs, specialized craftspeople, and a distinctive artistic tradition recognized as one of the great aesthetic achievements of any culture anywhere. The totem poles, for which Northwest Coast cultures are famous, are recent in one sense. Most existing poles date from the 1800s or later, but they represent a tradition of monumental wood carving that extends back many centuries. Archaeological evidence shows that large-scale wood carving was practiced on the coast for at least 2,000 years and probably much longer. The poles are not decorative objects. They are texts, genealogical and cosmological narratives carved in a visual language of extraordinary sophistication. To read a totem pole requires knowledge of the specific symbolic vocabulary of the culture that produced it, understanding of which animal represents which lineage, which transformation scene references which story, which compositional choice expresses which kind of relationship. The Northwest Coast cultures also practiced a distinctive economic system centered on the potlatch, a feast and gift-giving ceremony where hosts demonstrated status by distributing wealth to guests. The person who gave away the most, whose generosity was most extravagant, achieved the highest prestige. This is an economy based on circulation rather than accumulation, on generosity rather than possession, on social relationships rather than individual wealth. The potlatch was outlawed by Canadian and American authorities in the late 1800s, not because it caused harm, but because it embodied economic principles incompatible with industrial capitalism. The prohibition continued in Canada until 1951. The ceremonies continued anyway, practiced in secret, maintained by communities who understood that the potlatch was not simply a custom, but a fundamental expression of their social organization and their values. The archaeological record of the Northwest Coast shows continuous occupation extending back at least 10,000 years, possibly much longer. Shell middens, the accumulated refuse of shellfish consumption, form enormous mounds at some sites, layers of shell and bone and ash dozens of feet deep, representing thousands of years of continuous use of particular locations. The oldest known fish weirs in the Americas are found on the Northwest Coast, sophisticated structures built in streams and rivers to trap salmon during their spawning runs. Some of these weirs are more than 5,000 years old, demonstrating that the intensive salmon harvest that characterized historic Northwest Coast cultures has very deep roots. The Northwest Coast peoples developed techniques for working red cedar, a tree that provided the material for almost everything in their material culture, from canoes to houses to clothing to ceremonial objects. The splitting and bending and carving of cedar required tools and techniques refined over many centuries. The expertise visible in historic Northwest Coast woodworking represents the culmination of a very long tradition of experimentation and mastery. As sleep approaches and the mind begins to loosen its grip on the details of the waking world, let your attention rest on the image of a carved cedar pole, weathered and gray, standing on a beach where forest meets ocean. The pole has stood for perhaps a century, will stand for perhaps another few decades before the rain and the salt air complete their work, and it returns to the earth. But the knowledge that carved it, the understanding of form and symbol and meaning that guided the carver's hands, that knowledge is older than any standing pole, older than any living tree, transmitted across so many generations that its beginning is lost beyond the reach of memory. This is what endures, not the individual objects, though some do endure for centuries or even millennia. What endures is the knowledge, the accumulated understanding of how to live in a place, how to take from the land and the water without exhausting them, how to organize communities so that they can sustain themselves across generations, how to encode meaning in forms that speak to something deeper than immediate utility. The ancient peoples of North America, all of them, from the mound builders of the Mississippi Valley to the cliff dwellers of the Southwest to the salmon fishers of the Northwest coast, developed this knowledge over time spans that are difficult for modern minds to fully grasp. 10,000 years. 20,000 years. Time enough for hundreds of generations to build on the work of those who came before, to refine techniques, to discover new applications, to develop expertise so complete that it appeared to European observers as something instinctive rather than learned. But it was learned. It was taught. It was practiced and refined and passed forward, generation after generation, in an unbroken chain of transmission that connected the ancient past to the living present. That chain was broken in many places by the catastrophe of the post-contact period. Languages were lost, ceremonies were suppressed, communities were dispersed. Knowledge holders died before they could pass on what they knew. The extent of what was lost is incalculable, a tragedy not just for indigenous peoples, but for all of humanity, because what was lost was knowledge about how to live sustainably on this continent, knowledge developed through 10,000 years of patient observation and careful practice. But much survived. The salmon still run, the ceremonies are still performed, the languages, many of them, are still spoken. The knowledge, battered and diminished but unbroken, continues forward in the hands of communities who never stopped maintaining their relationships with the places their ancestors have known since time beyond memory. In the eastern woodlands, from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River, from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, the archaeological record shows continuous human occupation extending back to the end of the last ice age and beyond. The Archaic period cultures of the eastern woodlands, dating from roughly 8,000 to 3,000 years before the present, left behind evidence of sophisticated adaptation to forest environments. They developed tools for working wood, bone, and stone with precision. They hunted deer and turkey and bear. They gathered nuts and berries and roots in seasonal rounds that took them through different parts of the landscape at different times of year. And they built. The oldest mounds in eastern North America date to the Archaic period. Watson Break in Louisiana, a complex of 11 mounds connected by low earthen ridges, dates to approximately 5,400 years ago, making it older than the Egyptian pyramids, older than Stonehenge, one of the oldest monumental constructions in the world. What moves people to build monuments? The question runs through all of archaeology, appears in every region where humans have reshaped the landscape on large scales. The practical answers that mounds served as burial places or as platforms for buildings are true but incomplete. They do not explain why people would invest the enormous labor required to build on this scale, why communities would coordinate their efforts across years or decades to move Earth and shape it into forms that expressed something beyond immediate function. The answer, perhaps, lies in the human need to make meaning, to express through permanent works an understanding of what matters, of how the world is organized, of what relationships between people and place and cosmos need to be acknowledged and honored. The mounds are expressions of meaning. They are statements in earth and stone about what the builders believed and valued. They are, in a very real sense, philosophy made visible, cosmology rendered in 3 dimensions, knowledge about the structure of reality given permanent form. This is not primitive. This is sophisticated. This is human beings at their most essentially human, creating meaning and expressing it in forms designed to endure beyond any individual lifetime, beyond any single generation, into a future they could imagine but never see. The Adena culture of the Ohio River Valley built conical burial mounds and earthen enclosures from roughly 1,000 years before the Common Era to 100 years after. The Adena mounds, hundreds of them scattered across Ohio, West Virginia, Kentucky, and Indiana, were burial sites for individuals of high status. The grave goods found in Adena mounds show evidence of long-distance trade, of copper from Lake Superior and shells from the Gulf Coast, of mica from the Appalachians and obsidian from sources hundreds of miles to the west. The Adena was succeeded by the Hopewell tradition, which we have already discussed, and the Hopewell was succeeded by the Mississippian cultures, of which Cahokia was the largest and most complex expression. This succession represents not replacement, but transformation, each culture building on the achievements and the knowledge of those who came before. The mound-building tradition in eastern North America spans more than 5,000 years, from the earliest archaic period mounds to the final Mississippian constructions in the 15 and 1600s. Across this vast stretch of time, different cultures in different periods built different kinds of mounds for different purposes, but the underlying principle remained constant. The earth itself could be shaped to express meaning, to mark significance, to create places where the ordinary and the sacred intersected. Many of these mounds were destroyed in the 19th and early 20th centuries, plowed under by farmers who saw them as obstacles to cultivation, or excavated by amateur archaeologists whose methods destroyed as much as they revealed. The Smithsonian Institution's Bureau of Ethnology conducted systematic surveys of eastern mounds in the late 1800s, documenting thousands of sites. Many of those sites no longer exist. They were leveled, built over, erased from the landscape by development and agriculture, but thousands remain. They dot the landscape of the eastern United States, grass-covered rises in farmers' fields, wooded humps in suburban parks, protected sites in state and national preserves. They are still there, still holding their shapes, still marking the places where ancient peoples declared that something significant happened here, that this spot matters, that the earth itself should remember. The question of memory brings us to oral tradition, to the knowledge maintained in stories and songs and ceremonies passed down through generations without writing. For much of the history of archaeology as a discipline, oral tradition was dismissed as unreliable, as mythology rather than history, as narratives too corrupted by time and cultural change to contain accurate information about the distant past. This dismissal was a mistake. Research over the past several decades, particularly work done by indigenous scholars and by archaeologists willing to take oral tradition seriously, has demonstrated repeatedly that oral traditions can preserve accurate historical information across thousands of years. Australian Aboriginal traditions speak of rising sea levels, and changing coastlines in ways that align precisely with geological evidence of post-glacial sea level rise that occurred more than 10,000 years ago. The specific details of these traditions, descriptions of drowned landscapes and submerged islands and shifting shorelines, correspond to what actually happened when the Ice Age ended and the oceans rose. If Aboriginal traditions can preserve accurate memories of events 10,000 years in the past, there is no obvious reason to assume that Native American oral traditions are less reliable. Many Native American traditions speak of migrations, of great cities now abandoned, of climate events and catastrophes and periods when the relationship between people and the land was different than it is now. These traditions deserve to be heard. They deserve to be taken seriously as potential sources of historical information, not accepted uncritically, but engaged with respectfully, compared with archaeological and geological evidence, incorporated into our understanding where they illuminate aspects of the past that the physical record alone cannot reveal. The Osage peoples speak of mound builders in their oral traditions, describe a time when their ancestors encountered or were part of cultures that built great earthworks. When archaeologists began systematic investigation of the Ozark region in the 20th century, they found evidence of exactly what the Osage traditions described: ancient mounds and ceremonial sites predating any known historic occupation. The Hopi speak of previous worlds, of migrations and emergences, of places their ancestors lived before they arrived at their present homeland in northeastern Arizona. When archaeologists trace the movement of peoples across the Southwest through ceramic styles and architectural forms and radiocarbon dates, they find patterns that align remarkably well with what Hopi oral tradition describes. This does not mean that every detail of every oral tradition is literally accurate. Oral tradition, like any form of historical transmission, is subject to change and interpretation and the incorporation of new understanding. But it means that oral traditions contain genuine historical information, preserve real memories of real events, and should be respected as such. Sleep is very close now. The ancient continent is quiet around you. The mounds hold their shapes in the darkness. The stone circles on the high plains mark positions the stars will take tomorrow and the day after and the day after that, unchanging patterns in an ever-changing world. In the final section of this journey, we will consider what was lost and what survived, what the post-contact catastrophe meant for the knowledge systems of ancient America, and what the living descendants of the ancient builders maintain and carry forward into the future. For now, let the images settle. A serpent of earth coiling across an Ohio ridge. A bird effigy spreading stone wings across the Wisconsin landscape. A medicine wheel on a Wyoming summit, marking the summer sun. A totem pole on a misty beach, carved faces weathering slowly back into the cedar from which they emerged. These things are real, they exist. You can visit them, stand in their presence, feel the weight of the time they represent. They are not mystery in the sense of unsolvable puzzle. They are mystery in the sense of presence, of something vast and old and patient that invites contemplation without demanding resolution. Rest in that mystery. Let it hold you as you drift towards sleep. The ancient builders understood something about time that the modern world often forgets, that the work of a lifetime might be small, but the work of many lifetimes can move mountains, can reshape landscapes, can encode knowledge that endures when everything else has changed. The mounds are patient. The stones remember, the stories continue, sleep well. There is a moment that divides the ancient world of the Americas from everything that came after. It is not a single moment, not one date you can mark on a timeline, but rather a cascading series of catastrophes that unfolded across the 16th and 17th centuries, transforming the entire human landscape of two continents in ways so profound that we are still struggling to fully comprehend what was lost. The moment begins with contact. When Christopher Columbus reached the Caribbean in 1492, he initiated a biological exchange that would prove more devastating than any war, more transformative than any conquest. The people of the Americas had been isolated from the disease pools of Europe, Africa, and Asia for more than 10,000 years. They had no exposure to smallpox, no exposure to measles, to typhus, to influenza, to the suite of epidemic diseases that had evolved in the Old World in close association with domesticated animals and dense urban populations. When these diseases reached the Americas, they moved through indigenous populations with a speed and a lethality that still shocks epidemiologists who study the historical record. Smallpox, which has a mortality rate of roughly 30% in populations with some inherited immunity, may have killed 70 to 90% of infected individuals in populations with no previous exposure. And it spread faster than the Europeans themselves could travel, moving along indigenous trade routes, carried by infected individuals who did not yet show symptoms, reaching communities that had never seen a European face. The scale of the death is difficult to grasp. Conservative estimates suggest that indigenous populations in the Americas declined by 50% in the century after contact. More aggressive estimates suggest declines of 90% or more in some regions. If the pre-contact population of the Americas was 60 to 90 million people, as many scholars now believe, then the post-contact collapse represents one of the largest demographic catastrophes in human history. Tens of millions of people died within a few generations. This was not merely a demographic event. It was an epistemological catastrophe. Every person who died took with them everything they knew, everything they had learned, everything they could have taught. When a language speaker dies before passing on the language dies with them. When a knowledge holder dies before training an apprentice, the knowledge dies with them. When an entire community dies, all the accumulated understanding of that community, all the stories and songs and techniques and observations gathered across generations, all of it can disappear in a single season. The magnitude of what was lost is incalculable. We can only see the shadows, the gaps, the places where knowledge clearly once existed, but now is simply gone. Consider the question of plant knowledge, the understanding of which plants could be eaten, which could heal, which could poison, which could be used for fiber or dye or construction. The indigenous peoples of the Americas had been experimenting with the plants of this continent for 10,000 years or more. They had identified and cultivated dozens of crop species unknown in the Old World. Maize, beans, squash, potatoes, tomatoes, peppers, cacao, tobacco, cotton, sunflowers, amaranth, quinoa, manioc, sweet potatoes, peanuts, avocados, vanilla, pineapples. The list of plants domesticated in the Americas is staggering in its diversity and its global importance. These were not minor contributions to human agriculture. These were foundational crops that, when introduced to the Old World after contact, transformed global nutrition and made possible population growth on scales that would have been unthinkable without them. But the domesticated crops represent only a tiny fraction of plant knowledge. For every plant that was domesticated, there were dozens or hundreds that were known and used for specific purposes. Medicinal plants, plants that reduced fever or eased pain or treated infections or aided childbirth. Fiber plants, plants that could be processed into rope or cloth or baskets. Dye plants, plants that yielded specific colors for textiles and body paint. Poison plants, plants used for hunting or warfare or fishing. Construction plants, plants whose wood or bark or leaves were suited for particular building purposes. This knowledge was encyclopedic in its scope and extraordinarily detailed in its precision. It included not just which plants to use, but when to harvest them, how to prepare them, in what dosages, in combination with what other plants. It included understanding of which parts of the plant were useful and which were toxic, understanding of seasonal variation in potency, understanding of how to cultivate and propagate useful species. How much of this knowledge was lost in the post-contact catastrophe, we can only estimate by looking at what survived. Ethnobotanists working with indigenous communities in the 20th century documented knowledge of hundreds of medicinal plant species in single communities. If each community had comparable knowledge, and if 90% of communities were destroyed by disease and violence, then the scope of lost botanical knowledge is almost beyond comprehension. Some of that knowledge was recorded. Spanish missionaries and colonial administrators, whatever their other failings, recognized that indigenous people knew things about the plants of the Americas that Europeans did not. Some of them made efforts to document this knowledge, to record which plants were used for which purposes. The Florentine Codex, compiled by the Franciscan missionary Bernardino de Sahagun in the mid-1500s, contains detailed descriptions of Aztec botanical knowledge, including illustrations of plants and descriptions of their uses. But most indigenous botanical knowledge was never written down. It existed in oral tradition, in practice, in the accumulated experience of people who had been working with these plants for countless generations. When those people died without passing on what they knew, the knowledge died with them. The same is true of agricultural knowledge, of the specific techniques for cultivating crops in particular environments. The Inca developed more than 3,000 varieties of potato, each adapted to specific elevations, specific soil types, specific climatic conditions in the incredibly diverse landscapes of the Andes. This was not casual experimentation. This was systematic plant breeding carried out over centuries, possibly millennia, by people who understood heredity and selection even without the theoretical framework of modern genetics. In Mesoamerica, farmers developed sophisticated systems of chinampas, the so-called floating gardens of the Aztec capital Tenochtitlan. Chinampas were artificial islands built in shallow lake beds, constructed from layers of mud and vegetation, anchored by willow trees whose roots held the structure together. The chinampas created exceptionally fertile growing areas that could be cultivated year-round, producing multiple crops per year, supporting a dense urban population in an environment that would not otherwise have been able to sustain such numbers. The Spanish conquistadors who saw the chinampas in operation were impressed by their productivity and their ingenuity, but the knowledge of how to build and maintain them. The specific techniques of construction and the specific understanding of which crops to plant in which season and how to manage water levels and soil fertility. Much of this was lost when the indigenous population of the Valley of Mexico collapsed and the Spanish drained the lakes to build Mexico City on the ruins of Tenochtitlan. Some chinampas still exist. In Xochimilco, on the southern edge of Mexico City, descendants of the original chinampa farmers still cultivate the ancient gardens, still maintain the techniques that allowed their ancestors to feed a city of hundreds of thousands. But this is a remnant, a fragment of a once vast system maintained by a small community against enormous pressures of urbanization and modernization. The same pattern repeats across the Americas. Agricultural techniques of extraordinary sophistication, developed over thousands of years, were lost when the communities that practiced them were destroyed or dispersed or forcibly prevented from continuing their traditional practices. In the Amazon, the creation of terra preta, the dark earth soils that are vastly more fertile than the natural soils of the rainforest, was a technique that took centuries to develop and was practiced on enormous scales. Recent archaeological surveys have identified terra preta deposits covering thousands of square kilometers in the Amazon basin. This represents one of the largest human modifications of soil in the pre-industrial world, a transformation of the environment that made intensive agriculture possible in a region where natural soil fertility is very low. The technique for creating terra preta involved the deliberate incorporation of charcoal, bone, pottery shards, and organic matter into the soil in proportions that created a self-renewing fertility. The charcoal, in particular, provided a matrix that held nutrients and supported microbial communities in ways that prevented the rapid nutrient depletion typical of Amazonian soils. How exactly was this done? What was the specific recipe? What was the sequence of operations? How long did it take? These questions are not fully answerable because the people who created terra preta are gone and their knowledge went with them. Modern soil scientists can analyze terra preta and determine its composition, can even attempt to recreate it, but they are reverse engineering a technology whose original practitioners took their expertise to their grave. The destruction of indigenous knowledge was not only the result of disease. It was also the result of deliberate policy. When European colonial powers established control over the Americas, they recognized that indigenous cultural practices, indigenous languages, indigenous systems of belief posed obstacles to the colonial project. If indigenous peoples maintained their own languages, they could communicate among themselves in ways the colonizers could not monitor. If they maintained their own ceremonies, they maintained systems of authority and community organization that competed with colonial control. If they maintained their own understanding of land and resource use, they resisted the imposition of European property systems and labor regimes. The solution, from the colonial perspective, was cultural destruction. Deliberate, systematic, institutionalized cultural destruction. Missionaries banned indigenous ceremonies, declared them pagan and demonic, and punishable by severe penalties. Colonial administrators banned indigenous languages, required that official communication be conducted in Spanish or French or English or Portuguese. The goal was assimilation, the transformation of indigenous peoples into Christians who spoke European languages and accepted European authority. In the United States and Canada, this policy reached its most systematic expression in the boarding school system. Beginning in the late 1800s and continuing well into the 20th century. Indigenous children were forcibly removed from their families and placed in boarding schools where they were forbidden to speak their native languages, forbidden to practice their cultural traditions, subjected to harsh discipline and cultural indoctrination, designed to, in the words of one boarding school administrator, kill the Indian to save the man. The trauma inflicted by the boarding school system is still being reckoned with in indigenous communities today. Children who were taken from their families lost fluency in their native languages, lost connection to their cultural practices, lost the knowledge that would have been transmitted through normal processes of growing up within their communities. When they returned home, they were often unable to communicate with their own grandparents, had been estranged from the very traditions that defined their identity. The intergenerational effects of this trauma continue. Languages that were spoken by thousands of people in the 1800s are now spoken by dozens of elderly speakers. Cultural practices that were once central to community life are now maintained by small groups of dedicated practitioners working to revive what was almost lost. Knowledge of plants, of landscapes, of stories, of songs, all of it diminished by generations of forced assimilation. The Canadian government has acknowledged that the boarding school system constituted cultural genocide. The term is not hyperbole. It is an accurate description of a deliberate policy intended to destroy indigenous cultures by severing the transmission of cultural knowledge from one generation to the next. What was lost can never be fully recovered, but what survived, against all odds, is remarkable. The resilience of indigenous cultures in the face of this sustained assault is one of the most extraordinary stories in human history. Languages survived, not all of them. Of the more than 1,000 languages spoken in the Americas at the time of contact, hundreds are now extinct. But hundreds more are still spoken, maintained by communities who refuse to let them die, who taught them to their children in secret when teaching them openly was forbidden. who maintained fluency across generations of pressure to assimilate. The Navajo language, to take one example, is still spoken by more than 150,000 people, making it one of the most widely spoken indigenous languages in North America. During World War II, Navajo speakers served as code talkers in the Pacific Theater, using their language to transmit military communications in a code the Japanese could not break. The same language that American authorities had tried to suppress in boarding schools became a strategic asset, a language whose complexity and unfamiliarity to non-speakers made it ideal for secure communication. Ceremonies survived. The Hopi have maintained their ceremonial calendar continuously, a cycle of dances and observances that mark the turning of the seasons and maintain the relationships between the Hopi people and the spiritual forces they understand to inhabit their world. The ceremonies were conducted in secret during periods when they were banned, practiced at night, or in remote locations where colonial authorities could not observe them. When the bans were finally lifted, the ceremonies continued, unbroken, carried forward by communities who understood that letting them lapse would mean losing something irreplaceable. The Sun Dance of the Plains Peoples was banned by the United States government in 1883 and remained illegal until 1934. During this period, it was practiced in secret, in remote locations, by communities who risked punishment to maintain what they understood to be essential to their identity and their spiritual health. When the ban was lifted, the ceremony resurged. It is now practiced openly again by many Plains nations, a direct continuity with pre-contact practice maintained across a half-century of legal prohibition. Ecological knowledge survived. The Menominee Nation of Wisconsin has managed its forest lands according to traditional principles of sustainable harvest for more than a century and a half. The Menominee Forest has been continuously harvested for timber since the mid-1800s, but the total standing timber volume today is higher than it was when commercial harvest began. This is sustainable forestry in the truest sense, a working forest that produces economic value while maintaining its ecological integrity across multiple human generations. The techniques the Menominee use are not simply modern forestry science. They are informed by traditional ecological knowledge, by understanding of the forest as a living system that must be maintained in balance, by principles of reciprocity and respect that are embedded in Menominee culture. Modern forestry science has come, slowly and belatedly, to recognize that the indigenous approach to forest management often produces better long-term outcomes than industrial forestry models focused on maximum short-term yield. The same is true of fisheries management. Indigenous communities in the Pacific Northwest have maintained sustainable salmon harvest practices that recognize the salmon not as a commodity to be extracted, but as a relative with whom humans share a reciprocal relationship. When the salmon runs are strong, harvest can be substantial. When the runs are weak, harvest must be restrained to allow the population to recover. This is not sentimentality. This is sophisticated resource management based on long-term observation and careful attention to population dynamics. In the past several decades, the scientific community has begun to recognize that traditional indigenous knowledge is not folklore or mythology to be documented and set aside. It is genuine knowledge, often with practical applications that equal or exceed what Western science can offer. The term traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK, has gained currency in academic and policy circles. It refers to the accumulated knowledge that indigenous communities have developed about the ecosystems they inhabit, knowledge based on generations or centuries of close observation and practical interaction with particular environments. TEK includes understanding of animal behavior, of plant ecology, of weather patterns, of geological processes, of the complex relationships between different species and different elements of the landscape. It is typically place-based, specific to particular regions, developed through intimate long-term engagement with particular environments rather than through the generalized theoretical approaches of Western science. Studies comparing TEK with Western scientific knowledge in the same domains have repeatedly found that indigenous knowledge is accurate, detailed, and often more nuanced than what Western science has discovered. Indigenous observers in the Arctic, for example, noticed changes in animal behavior and ice conditions related to climate change years or decades before Western scientists documented the same phenomena. The indigenous observers had longer observational baselines, were paying attention to more subtle indicators, and were more attuned to small changes because their lives and their livelihoods depended on that attention. The recognition of TEK has led to changes in how resource management decisions are made in some jurisdictions. In Canada, co-management agreements between Indigenous nations and federal or provincial governments now govern many fisheries, forests, and wildlife populations. These agreements incorporate traditional knowledge alongside Western scientific data, recognize Indigenous communities as legitimate authorities with expertise equal to that of trained biologists or ecologists. This is a significant shift. For most of the colonial period, Indigenous knowledge was dismissed, ignored, or actively suppressed. The assumption was that Western science represented the only valid form of knowledge about the natural world, that Indigenous understanding was primitive or superstitious, or at best anecdotal. The recognition that this assumption was wrong, that Indigenous knowledge systems are sophisticated and empirically grounded, and often more accurate than Western science in specific contexts, represents a fundamental rethinking of epistemology, of what counts as knowledge and who counts as an expert. The past several decades have also seen extraordinary advances in the archaeological understanding of ancient America, driven by new technologies and new approaches that are revealing the true scale and complexity of pre-contact civilizations. LiDAR, light detection and ranging, has revolutionized archaeology in forested regions. LiDAR uses laser pulses transmitted from aircraft to map the ground surface beneath vegetation. When you process the returns from a LiDAR survey, you can effectively remove the forest canopy and see the bare earth, revealing features that would be invisible to ground-level observation or traditional aerial photography. In the Maya region of Central America, LIDAR surveys have revealed that what archaeologists thought were isolated ceremonial centers were actually nodes in continuous urban landscapes. Cities that were estimated to have held tens of thousands of people may have held hundreds of thousands. Agricultural terracing and water management systems that were only partially documented from ground surveys turn out to extend across entire landscapes, suggesting agricultural production on scales that completely change our understanding of Maya civilization's carrying capacity. In the Amazon basin, LIDAR has revealed the full extent of the ancient urban centers that are now hidden beneath the rainforest. In 2022, a study published in the journal Nature documented more than 200 ancient settlements in the Llanos de Mojos region of Bolivia. Connected by thousands of kilometers of raised causeways surrounded by agricultural earthworks and water control systems that transformed tens of thousands of square kilometers of landscape. The settlements show evidence of central planning, of geometric layouts, of astronomical alignments. The largest sites had populations in the tens of thousands. The entire network may have supported a regional population of 500,000 or more people, living in what we thought was pristine rainforest, but was actually a densely inhabited, intensively managed landscape. This changes everything about how we understand Amazonian history. The Amazon before contact was not a wilderness sparsely populated by small bands of foragers. It was home to sophisticated civilizations that practiced intensive agriculture, built cities, and transformed the landscape on scales comparable to what was happening in Mesoamerica or the Andes. The forests the Spanish encountered in the 16th century were not primordial. They were growing back over the ruins of civilizations that had been emptied by disease in the decades following first contact. The wilderness that modern conservationists have sought to preserve is partly a product of the post-contact collapse, a landscape that had been managed for thousands of years suddenly left without its managers. This realization has profound implications for conservation. If the Amazon is not a pristine wilderness, but a cultural landscape shaped by millennia of human activity, then the project of preserving it in some imagined natural state is based on a misunderstanding of its history. The most biodiverse parts of the Amazon, the regions with the highest concentrations of useful plants, are often the regions where terra preta indicates long-term human occupation. The forest we want to save was, in significant part, cultivated. Ancient DNA research has similarly transformed our understanding of American population history. The extraction and sequencing of DNA from ancient human remains is a technically challenging process. DNA degrades over time, breaks into small fragments, becomes contaminated with modern genetic material or with bacterial DNA. But improvements in sequencing technology and in contamination control have made it possible to recover usable genetic data from remains thousands of years old. The picture emerging from ancient DNA studies is complex. The initial peopling of the Americas involved at least two and probably more distinct migration events, bringing populations with different genetic signatures. These populations did not remain isolated. They moved, they mixed, they contributed to a genetic landscape that was diverse and dynamic long before European contact. Some ancient individuals show genetic signatures that are not present in modern populations, or are present only in very low frequencies. This suggests that some of the earliest populations in the Americas were largely replaced by later arrivals, or that they mixed with later populations in proportions that diluted their distinctive genetic markers nearly to invisibility. The Cahokia man case is illustrative. Cahokia man, whose remains were found in Washington state and dated to roughly 9,000 years ago, became the center of a legal battle between scientists who wanted to study the remains and Native American tribes who claimed him as an ancestor and wanted him reburied according to traditional practices. Early analysis of Cahokia man's skull suggested that he did not resemble modern Native Americans, but showed similarities to Polynesian or even European populations. This led to speculation that the earliest inhabitants of the Americas might have come from populations other than those ancestral to modern Native Americans. But when ancient DNA was finally extracted from Cahokia man's remains, it showed conclusively that he was genetically related to modern Native Americans, specifically to tribes in the region where he was found. The skull morphology that seemed unusual was not the result of different ancestry, but of the morphological variation that exists within related populations, variation that can be misleading if you try to assign ancestry based on skull shape alone. Cahokia man was repatriated to the tribes and reburied in 2017, his genetic data having settled a question that skull measurements could not answer definitively. But his case illustrates both the power of ancient DNA to resolve questions about ancestry and the importance of consultation and collaboration with descendant communities who have their own claims to knowledge about the past. The genetic evidence has also revealed connections that oral traditions had long maintained, but that Western scholarship had often dismissed. Polynesian contact with South America, proposed for decades based on the presence of the sweet potato, a South American plant in Polynesia before European contact, is now confirmed by genetic evidence. Analysis of chicken bones from pre-contact South American sites shows that the chickens were genetically related to Polynesian chickens rather than European breeds, confirming that Pacific voyagers reached South America before Columbus. More recent genetic studies have found small amounts of Polynesian genetic ancestry in some indigenous South American populations, further evidence that contact was not limited to a single accidental voyage, but involved enough interaction for genetic exchange to occur. The scale and frequency of this trans-Pacific contact remain debated. Was it regular trade sustained over generations, or was it a few voyages separated by centuries? The evidence so far suggests the latter, occasional contact rather than systematic exchange, but the mere fact that Polynesian voyagers crossed thousands of miles of open ocean and reached South America in the pre-contact period demonstrates a level of maritime capability and navigational knowledge that is extraordinary. The sweet potato itself is evidence of contact in the other direction, from South America to Polynesia. The plant could not have reached the Pacific Islands without human transport. Someone at some point carried sweet potato tubers from South America across the ocean to islands, where the plant became a staple crop. This required not just a single voyage, but the knowledge and intention to transport live plants, to keep them alive during a voyage of weeks or months, to introduce them to new environments where they could be cultivated. These are not accidents. These are deliberate acts of exploration, trade, and knowledge exchange across distances that still challenge modern sailors. Lake Superior contains one of the largest deposits of native copper anywhere on the planet. Native copper is pure copper, not copper ore, occurring naturally in a form that requires no smelting, that can be worked directly with stone hammers and heat. The copper deposits of the Lake Superior region were mined extensively in ancient times. Thousands of mining pits have been documented on Isle Royale and the Quinault Peninsula, some of them 20 feet deep, cut into solid rock with stone mauls. The scale of extraction was enormous. Conservative estimates suggest that at least several 100,000 pounds of copper were removed from these mines, with some estimates running into the millions of pounds. The copper was traded across enormous distances. Copper artifacts from Lake Superior sources have been found in burial mounds and archaeological sites from the Atlantic coast to the Gulf of Mexico, from the Great Plains to the Appalachians. The Hopewell trade network, which we have discussed, was one of the primary mechanisms for distributing this copper. But the question remains, where did all of it go? The amount of copper extracted from Lake Superior mines over thousands of years far exceeds the amount of copper found in archaeological contexts. This is sometimes called the missing copper problem. Several explanations are plausible. Copper is recyclable. Artifacts were melted down and reformed repeatedly across generations, so a single pound of copper might appear in the archaeological record as a dozen different objects from different time periods. Copper also corrodes, particularly in acidic soils. Artifacts buried in certain conditions may have degraded completely, leaving no trace. And much of the extracted copper may simply be in archaeological contexts we have not yet discovered, buried in sites that have not been excavated or in regions that have not been systematically surveyed. The mining itself stopped around 3,000 years ago. Why it stopped is unclear. The copper was still there. The demand for copper, judging from its continued appearance in burial goods and trade networks, did not decline, but the large-scale systematic mining that had characterized the previous millennia ceased. Climate change is a possibility. The period around 3,000 years ago saw significant climate shifts in the Great Lakes region. Changes in lake levels, changes in vegetation patterns, changes in the distribution of game animals, any or all of these could have disrupted the social and economic systems that had organized the copper mining. The copper working tradition did not end, but it transformed. Later cultures continued to work copper, to trade it, to incorporate it into ceremonial objects and tools, but the scale of production never again reached what it had been during the height of the old copper complex. The legacy of ancient copper mining is still visible on Isle Royale. If you hike the island's trails, you can find the ancient pits, depressions in the bedrock where stone hammers bit into the earth 3,000 years ago, where human beings working with the simplest tools extracted one of the most useful metals known to our species. As sleep draws very near, as the conscious mind begins to release its hold on the details and the questions and the long chains of evidence and interpretation, let your thoughts rest on the simplest and most profound truth about ancient America. People were here. For 20,000 years, perhaps longer, people lived on this continent in every environment it offered. They learned its plants and its animals and its seasons and its moods. They developed knowledge so detailed and so place-specific that it took lifetimes to acquire and generations to refine. They built monuments that have lasted longer than empires. They cultivated crops that feed billions of people today. They created art of stunning beauty and power. They organized societies of remarkable complexity. They observed the sky with patience and precision and encoded what they learned in earthworks aligned to celestial cycles. They were not primitive. They were not waiting for civilization to arrive from elsewhere. They were civilization, in forms adapted to the specific conditions of this continent, expressing human creativity and human intelligence and human spirituality in ways that were distinctly American, but also deeply, recognizably human. And when catastrophe came, when disease reduced populations by 90% in some regions, when colonial powers banned languages and ceremonies and forcibly removed children from their families to break the transmission of culture, when everything seemed designed to erase indigenous peoples from the landscape and from history, they survived. Not all of them. The losses were staggering, irreversible, tragic beyond measure. Languages gone forever, knowledge systems destroyed, communities obliterated. The magnitude of what was lost will never be fully known because we cannot quantify what we do not know existed. But they survived, the languages still spoken, the ceremonies still practiced, the knowledge still maintained. The communities still here, still connected to the places their ancestors have known since before memory, still carrying forward practices and understandings and relationships that have roots stretching back thousands of years. This survival, this resilience, this refusal to vanish is as remarkable as any monument in stone or earth. It is a testament to something essential about human beings, about our capacity to endure, to adapt, to hold on to what matters across generations of hardship and loss. The mounds are still there, grass-covered and patient, holding their alignments. The cliff dwellings are still there, empty rooms in the canyon walls where swallows nest and tourists marvel. The great houses of Chaco are still there, sandstone walls under the endless desert sky, still oriented to the sun. And the people are still there, not as museum exhibits, not as relics of a vanished past, but as living communities with their own futures to determine, their own knowledge to maintain and develop, their own relationships with the lands that hold the evidence of what their ancestors built. The archaeological work continues. Every year brings new discoveries, new applications of technology, new collaborations between indigenous communities and researchers, new understandings that refine or overturn what we thought we knew. Ground-penetrating radar, is revealing features beneath the surface without excavation, allowing archaeologists to map sites before deciding where to dig, preserving more of the archaeological record undisturbed. Isotope analysis of ancient bones and teeth is revealing where individuals lived at different points in their lives, documenting migrations and trade connections at the level of individual human stories. Paleobotanical analysis of charred seeds and pollen is reconstructing ancient diets and agricultural practices with increasing precision. The story of ancient America is not a closed book. It is a book still being written, with new chapters added every time a new site is excavated, every time a new survey is completed, every time a new analytical technique reveals something that was always there, but invisible to previous generations of researchers. What will we know 20 years from now that we do not know today? What sites are still hidden beneath forests or fields, waiting for a LiDAR survey to reveal their presence? What ancient DNA is still waiting in museum collections, ready to tell stories about migrations and mixing and the complex human history of this continent? What knowledge is still held in indigenous communities, waiting for the right questions and the right relationships to bring it into dialogue with archaeological evidence? The possibilities are vast, the questions are open, and the ancient continent, patient and enormous, still holds more stories than we have yet learned to hear. In the final moments before sleep takes you completely, hold this image in your mind: a night sky over the Great Plains. The Milky Way, a river of light overhead. On a high ridge, a medicine wheel, stones arranged in a circle with spokes radiating from a central cairn. The stones are old, weathered, but they hold their positions. In a few hours, the summer sun will rise over the eastern horizon at a point marked by one of the cairns. It has risen at this point every summer for as long as the wheel has stood, for as long as human eyes have watched this sky and marked its patterns. The people who built the wheel understood that the sky was constant, that the stars followed paths as reliable as the paths of migrating herds, that the sun marked the seasons with perfect precision. They built to acknowledge this constancy, to create on earth a reflection of the order they perceived in the heavens. And now, 1,000 years or more after the stones were placed, the alignment still holds. The sun will rise where it always rises on this day of the year. The stones will mark the moment, and anyone standing at the right spot, if they know what they are watching for, will witness the same convergence of earth and sky that the ancient builders witnessed. This is continuity. This is the deep time of the continent. This is the patient endurance of stone and earth, and the equally patient endurance of knowledge, passed forward through generations, maintained against all disruption, still here. The mounds are patient. The stones remember. The stars turn in their courses, indifferent and beautiful and constant. And you, lying in darkness, are connected to all of it, participant in the same world that the ancient builders knew, sleeping on the same ancient continent, under the same patient sky. Rest now. The story continues. The work continues. The great quiet continent holds its secrets still, holds its stories still, holds in earth and stone the evidence of everything that was built and everything that was known across 20,000 years of human presence. The questions remain open. The mysteries remain patient. And somewhere in the dark, beneath the grass, beneath the forest, beneath the fields and the parking lots and the modern cities, the past is still there, still waiting, still speaking in the language of earth and alignment and the slow accumulation of evidence. Sleep well, dream of ancient things. The mounds are patient, they will wait. The stars are turning. The ancient continent is quiet around you, full of stories still being discovered, still being told. And in the morning when you wake, the past will still be there, patient and enormous, waiting for the next question. The next discovery, the next moment of understanding that brings the ancient world a little closer, makes its voice a little clearer, reveals one more piece of the vast and complex truth about what this continent was, what happened here. Who built these monuments that still stand after 1,000 years? The sleep comes easier now. The mind releases. The ancient things hold you gently, the mounds and the stars and the patient stones, the long continuity of human presence on this continent, the deep knowledge encoded in earth and sky. Rest. The story is not finished. The ancient continent holds you in its long memory. Where you too are part of the pattern, part of the story, connected across time to everyone who has looked up at these stars and wondered, everyone who has shaped the earth and tried to make meaning from their moment in the turning of the world. The mounds are patient. The stars are constant. And the mystery, the vast and beautiful mystery of what human beings have achieved on this ancient continent across 20,000 years of creativity and adaptation and survival, that mystery holds you now as you drift into sleep. Good night. The ancient world is all around you. The past is patient. The stories continue. Sleep now and dream of the deep time, the long human story, the patient earth holding all of it, remembering all of it, waiting to reveal more of its secrets to those who ask with care and listen with respect. The mounds are patient. They will wait. The ancient continent is quiet, and you are home, sleeping on ground that holds 20,000 years of human story, resting in the embrace of the deepest history, the longest memory, the patient and enormous truth of ancient America. Rest well.